At an exclusive private dinner, a mysterious masked guest dressed like a skeleton publicly humiliates a quiet man at the table, mocking him, embarrassing him, making the entire room laugh. What nobody realizes is that the quiet man is actually Will Smith keeping a low profile. And when the truth comes out, the energy in the room shifts instantly. What happens next changes the entire night, and no one there ever forgets it. Now, before we get into the story, make sure you watch until the very end, because the final moment flips everything. And if you love dramatic reversals like this, hit subscribe. You don't want to miss what's coming next. The dinner was supposed to be elegant. Crystal glasses, low golden lighting, soft music drifting across the private rooftop venue overlooking the city skyline. Influencers, executives, and industry insiders filled the long tables, laughing a little louder than necessary, performing sophistication for one another. At the far end of the table sat a man in a simple black jacket.
No flashy jewelry. No entourage.
Just calm posture and quiet observation. Most people didn't recognize him. He wanted it that way. Across from him, however, was someone who wanted attention, and was getting it. A tall figure dressed in a designer skeletal suit, complete with a sculpted skull mask and silver detailing. The outfit wasn't cheap. It was theatrical, dramatic, and impossible to ignore. People called him Skeleton as a joke, and he leaned into it. He told loud stories, interrupted conversations, mocked people playfully, but with just enough edge to make it uncomfortable. Then his attention locked onto the quiet man at the end of the table. "You look familiar," Skeleton said loudly, tilting his mask slightly. "Or maybe you just look like someone who used to be famous." A few people laughed. The quiet man smiled politely. Skeleton leaned forward. "No offense," he continued, voice rising, "but you've been real quiet. Cat got your tongue? Or are you just enjoying the free meal?" More laughter. Phones subtly lifted. Not obvious, but ready. The quiet man folded his hands calmly on the table. "I'm just listening," he said evenly. Skeleton chuckled exaggeratedly. "Listening? At a dinner like this? No, no. You've got to entertain. That's the rule." He turned to the table. "Right? Or am I the only one bringing energy tonight?" Applause. Smirks. Someone clinked a glass. The quiet man took a sip of water. Skeleton wasn't done. "Let me guess," he continued. "You're one of those used to be big guys. Probably had your moment. Now just telling stories about it." A sharper wave of laughter rolled through the table. Still, the man didn't react. But the camera flashes were increasing now, because someone at the table had finally whispered a name that traveled seat by seat like a quiet electric current. "Wait, that's Will Smith." The whisper didn't reach Skeleton. Not yet. He stood slightly, raising his glass. "Here's to second chances," he joked, gesturing toward the quiet man. "Maybe one day you'll shock us again." The room shifted, subtly, because more people were checking, zooming in, comparing, and then someone at the far end of the table said it out loud. "That is Will Smith." Silence. It wasn't dramatic at first, just a thinning of laughter, a tightening of expressions. Skeleton paused mid-smirk. "What?" he said, slightly amused. The quiet man slowly stood.
No ruse. No anger.
He adjusted his jacket, and in the soft golden light, unmistakable now, was Will Smith. The mask on Skeleton's face suddenly looked heavier. The energy that had felt playful seconds earlier now felt exposed. Because this wasn't a random guest. This was someone who had spent decades on the world stage. Someone who had seen criticism at the highest level. Someone who understood humiliation and resilience. Will looked around the table, meeting eyes. "I appreciate the energy," he said calmly. "But you never really know who you're talking to."
No sarcasm. No aggression.
Just clarity. The room felt smaller. Skeleton tried to laugh it off. "Hey man, it's all jokes," he said quickly. "All entertainment." Will nodded. "Of course." He paused. "But respect is entertainment too." That line landed harder than anything Skeleton had said all night. Phones were no longer subtle. They were recording openly. The atmosphere that had once favored Skeleton now leaned toward Will. And Skeleton felt it. He shifted in his seat. "Well, if I'd known," Will gently interrupted. "That's the point," he said. Another pause. "You shouldn't need to know." That sentence traveled further than any insult could. Because it wasn't about status. It wasn't about fame. It was about how quickly people perform when they think there's no consequence. Skeleton slowly removed his skull mask. Not dramatically, almost carefully. Underneath was a young entrepreneur trying to build an online persona around boldness and shock value. But tonight, the shock had flipped. "I didn't mean disrespect," he said quietly. Will studied him for a moment. "I know," he replied. "But impact doesn't ask about intent." That hit deeper than the earlier humiliation. The guests who had laughed earlier now looked uncomfortable. Because they realized something too. They hadn't just watched humiliation. They had participated. Will didn't raise his voice. He didn't demand apologies. He simply picked up his glass. "To growth," he said, and sat back down. The moment wasn't explosive. It was controlled, which somehow made it more powerful. Skeleton, now without the mask, remained seated, unusually quiet, because the biggest reversal wasn't fame being revealed. It was maturity being displayed. The dinner continued, but the dynamic had permanently changed. Conversations were softer, more thoughtful, and every person at that table understood something they hadn't when the night began. What most people didn't realize as the night unfolded was that the shift wasn't just social, it was psychological. The laughter that had once filled the rooftop now felt cautious. Conversations restarted, but with a different tone. People chose their words more carefully. The performance energy had thinned, replaced by something closer to awareness. And at the center of it all sat Will, no longer just the quiet guest, but the gravity in the room. Across the table, the former Skeleton avoided eye contact at first. His confidence, which had been fueled by anonymity and attention, now seemed fragile without the mask. He reached for his drink but didn't sip it. His mind was clearly racing. A few seats down, two executives whispered. "That clip is already circulating," one muttered, glancing at his phone. "Comments are turning," the other replied. And they were right. Within minutes, snippets of the exchange had hit social media. Not the beginning, not the loud mockery, but the moment of reversal. The calm correction. The line about respect. The subtle dismantling of arrogance. Online, the narrative was forming fast. Some praised Will's composure. Others debated the culture of humiliation as entertainment. Influencers began posting think pieces before dessert had even been served. But back at the table, something quieter was happening. The young man who had worn the skeleton suit finally leaned forward. "Can I ask you something?" he said, voice no longer amplified for attention. Will looked at him. "Go ahead. How do you stay that calm?" he asked. "When someone's clearly trying to get under your skin?" Will didn't answer immediately. He studied the skyline beyond the glass railing, the city lights blinking like distant thoughts. "You learn that reaction is expensive," he said at last. "And not everyone deserves the cost." The words settled heavily. The young man nodded slowly. "I built my brand on shock," he admitted. "People only pay attention when you push." Will gave a faint smile. Attention isn't the same as respect. That distinction hit harder than the earlier correction. Around them, a few guests pretended not to listen, but they were, because the story had evolved. It was no longer about humiliation. It was about exposure, about what happens when persona meets reality. One of the event organizers approached cautiously. "Mr. Smith," she began, nervous. "We'd love if you said a few words tonight." The guests would. Will raised a hand gently. "I already did." She paused, confused at first. Then she understood. The lesson had already been delivered. No microphone required. Meanwhile, the young entrepreneur stared at the skull mask resting beside his plate. Earlier, it had felt powerful. A symbol of boldness, of fearless commentary. Now it looked theatrical in a different way. Almost hollow. You ever regret moments? He asked quietly. Will considered that. Regret is useful, he said. If it teaches. And if it doesn't, then it repeats. The simplicity of the answer left no room for excuses. A soft breeze moved across the rooftop. The tension that had once felt sharp was now reflective. People weren't mocking anymore. They were thinking. Phones continued buzzing. One viral caption read, "The moment the Joker realized he picked the wrong target." Another said, "Composure, clout." But the young man wasn't reading comments now. He was looking inward. "I thought confidence meant never backing down," he said. "But you didn't attack me. You didn't embarrass me back." Will leaned back in his chair. "Power doesn't need to prove itself," he replied. That sentence carried weight. Because earlier the room had rewarded volume. It had celebrated boldness without balance. But now it was witnessing something else, restraint as strength. As the night drew closer to its end, small groups began forming around the rooftop. Conversations were deeper, less performative. The event had transformed without announcement. And when Will finally stood to leave, there was no dramatic exit.
No aplosque.
Just quiet acknowledgement. The young man stood too. "I owe you an apology," he said. Will shook his head slightly. "You owe yourself better," he responded. That was the final shift. Because humiliation fades, but growth lingers. As Will walked toward the elevator, the city lights reflected in the glass doors. The rooftop behind him buzzed softly, no longer chaotic, but contemplative. And the young entrepreneur remained at the table a little longer, staring at the mask that once amplified his voice. He didn't put it back on. Not that night. Because the biggest reversal hadn't been fame revealed. It had been identity confronted. And long after the dinner ended, long after the clips finished trending, the real impact of that moment continued quietly. Not in headlines, not in viral loops, but in the way one young man decided to build differently from that night forward.